Okay, so last time we talked about Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Mormons. Now we're moving to a new grouping, and this is Judaism and Islam. These two share a different set of commonalities with Christianity. Remember, the first three were all 19th century groups that thought that they were reforming the church and fixing things that were wrong with the church. And so we had a lot of commonalities on that front. They all talk about Jesus, et cetera, et cetera. Here, we've got some different commonalities. And so I'll start with the commonalities between all three, and then we'll go first Judaism and then Islam. So commonalities, of course, number one, monotheism, right? The idea that there is one God, not several or many. And all three would believe that. And a little more specifically, of course, in all three, God is personal. God is a person. He's not a force. He's not a principle. He's an actual person who with feelings and ideas and all of that sort of thing. And that same God makes himself known, which is important, because if God did not make himself known, how would we know him? So all three would say, yes, God makes himself known to us. All three would say that the Old Testament is given by God, that it was revelation from God. All three would say that Abraham is where it all started, that Moses is one of the most important figures, and that the prophets, that there have been prophets, and those prophets were people that spoke for God. So that's a lot of commonality. And then, of course, the last piece, which leads to much of the contention that we'll be talking about later on, is geography. All three have a connection, not just to Judea and to Palestine, but in particular to Jerusalem. And so we'll see that as we go. So we've got some common ground. We'll look at what the specific differences are as we go. So we're starting with Judaism. And the one thing that we need to do first when we're talking about Judaism is make sure that we understand the terms that we're working with here. Because these four words get thrown around by people kind of carelessly sometimes, and they don't know, they're not always using them the same way or the right way. Now, so Judaism, and I have a chart coming up next that I hope really help you understand it, but Judaism is the religion. All right, we practice Judaism. Judaism is a belief system. It's a religion. It's what was founded by, began with Abraham, codified by Moses. That's the religion. The Jews are the ethnic people, right? People that are genetically descended from Abraham. They are people who could trace their lineage, in some part back to Abraham. That makes them an ethnic group, like many other ethnic groups in the world. Hebrew is actually the language that people spoke in ancient times. Many of them, some of them speak to this day, but it's a Semitic language, and here's where we start to get a little confusion. Sometimes, and even in the text of Scripture, it will refer to the Hebrews, right? People who speak Hebrew, the Hebrews, as synonymous for Jews. But of course, we know that not all Jews speak Hebrew at any time in history. And then the last one is Israelite. And that's geographic. That's the people that live either in the ancient kingdom, Saul and David and Solomon's kingdom, or in the modern nation state after 1948. People who live there are Israelites. But of course, not all Jews are Israelites, and not all Jews practice Judaism. Not all those who practice Judaism are Jews or Israelites. And of course, not all Israelites are Jews. About 20% of the people living in Israel today are Arabs, and in the ancient world, there were non-Jews living in Israel as well. So let's take a look at this chart, and I hope this clarifies it. Because we've got three separate groups. We've got Jews, Judaism, and Israelite, and in the middle, you have Jewish Israelites who practice Judaism. So they're descended from Abraham, they live in the land either back then or now, and they follow the religion. That's one group that has all three. But there's another group that are Jewish who practice Judaism. They just don't live in Israel. They're in the diaspora. They're living in America or in South America or someplace else. They don't live in Israel. They're still Jews. They still practice Judaism, but they're not Israelites. And then you have another group that are Jewish Israelites. They live in the land. They're descended from Abraham, but they don't practice the religion. There's a significant number of people in modern-day Israel who are not religious. And so that part of their heritage is not as big for them. And then you have probably the smallest group, but an interesting one, those who are not Jewish. They're not descended from Abraham. They live in Israel, but they practice Judaism. That's a much smaller number. And so you have combinations of these things. You meet someone who's Jewish, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're an Israelite or that they practice Judaism. And so you've got these different combinations, and it can be confusing to people. If you meet someone who's Jewish, that doesn't necessarily mean they practice Judaism. They might not be religious at all, right? As an American, that doesn't mean you're automatically a Christian, right? You could be non-religious, you could be something else. Although in the church history, we used to think that way. Basically, if you were born in certain centuries, in certain countries, you automatically were considered to be that, right? If you were born in the Netherlands, you were Dutch Reformed. If you were born in Germany, you were Lutheran. If you were born in France, you were Catholic. If you're born in England, you're an Anglican. It was just kind of like automatic. But that's not true, of course, and it's not true in Israel either. So I hope that clarifies it a little bit. Sometimes we just need to know who it is that we're talking to or talking about when we're using these words, and we'll try to use them consistently. And when we talk about the scriptures, the Jewish scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, either one, we've got some other words that we need to clarify and define. The first, of course, is the word Torah. And you might have heard Torah before. It's a word that means a variety of things. It could mean the doctrine, the teaching, the instruction, the law. It gets used a lot of ways by both Christians referring to the Jewish scriptures or by Jewish people themselves. Technically speaking, the Torah are just the first 5 books, the law of Moses, the teaching. That is the first section of the Tanakh. The Tanakh are what we call the Old Testament. They would call the scriptures, simply, of course. 24 books. The first section is the Torah. The middle section is the Nevi'im. That would be the prophets. And their definition of prophet is a little bit different than the Christian definition of prophet. For example, Moses is considered a prophet, and some of the other ones that you might not necessarily think of. And then lastly, the Ketuvim are the writings, basically the other, history, poetry, that kind of thing. So their scriptures have 3 sections that they're divided into, but often people will talk about the Torah, and they're just talking about the scriptures. They're using it much more generically, or they're talking about the law of Judaism in general, not necessarily literally just the books of Moses. So it's one of those words that gets a lot of stretching, a lot of application. So if someone's talking about the Torah, you'll want to know, do you mean just these 5 books? Are you talking about the law in general? What are you actually talking about? The Talmud is commentary on the Tanakh. All right? Most ministers have a set or several sets of biblical commentaries written by a variety of guys that help them understand what the text of Scripture is saying. The Talmud are 2 groups of writings, one from 200 BC known as the Mishnah, and the other, the Gemara, from 500 AD. There's a difference there, right? 200 BC, those originated, most of them in Babylon, the Jewish community that remained there. The Gemara would be after the destruction of the temple in the diaspora, but you've got a large collection of commentaries by various rabbis and scholars on what does this verse from Leviticus mean, and what does this story from the book of Daniel tell us, right? Commentary. Midrash is a style that is found in much of the Talmud where you're trying to interpret that literature in a way for practical application. All right? Not just theology, but what does it mean for me? So if you are doing Midrash as a Hebrew scholar or a rabbi, you are trying to figure out, how do I apply this scripture to the lives of the people. And then the last one I put in there just because it's a word you will see. It's not a Hebrew word at all. It's a Greek word. That's the Pentateuch. And that's another word for the Torah, for the first 5 books of Moses. But it comes from Greek, but you'll probably see it bandied around. The picture on the bottom left is Hebrew script. The one on the right is a scroll of the Old Testament. Of course, they still use scrolls in the synagogues because that was the original way in which they were kept, as most ancient writing was kept on a scroll before the introduction of books in the Christian era. And so we've got a set of scriptures, and then we've got one other thing to make note of about those scriptures, and that's the Greek Septuagint. You will see this commonly referred to simply as LXX with capitals, which is, of course, Roman numerals for 70, because the legend has it that 70 different scholars translated this. It's a translation of the Tanakh, of the Hebrew Scriptures, that happened in the Alexandrian Jewish community. The Ptolemies were running Egypt. He's a the descendants of one of Alexander's generals. And there was a large Jewish community there, and nobody really could understand their theology. What are they about? And so the Ptolemaic king said, we got to get a copy of your scriptures in Greek so that we can actually understand what you guys are talking about. And so he had them make this translation into Koine Greek, which is the same Greek of the New Testament, the common everyday Greek. And this is 3rd century BC, so it predates the time of Christ by about 3 centuries. This would be in the period of the Maccabees. The Jewish community throughout the Middle East liked it. They appreciated it, because if you're living in the diaspora, in particular, if you're living in Egypt, in Italy, in Babylon, you may not have much Hebrew. You may not understand Hebrew that well because the people around you aren't speaking it. Most of them, or many of them, are fluent in Greek. It's the language of commerce. It's the language of education in this time. And so it was very well accepted by them. And actually, we can determine, because there are slight differences between the Hebrew scriptures and this Greek translation of them, we can tell when the New Testament authors are quoting the Hebrew scriptures and when they're quoting the Greek Septuagint, because of the slight difference in some of the wording, because they're, of course, quoting it in Greek, because they're writing in Greek. And we know, therefore, that the New Testament authors had no problem quoting the Greek Septuagint as Scripture. The Word says, the Lord said through the prophet, and then they quote the Septuagint, rather than translating the Hebrew Scriptures directly themselves. And it's not a huge issue in this, but if we were talking about the history of the church, or we're talking about the history of the Bible, that's an important point, because it shows that the early church didn't believe the scriptures had to remain in the language they were originally written in. It was okay to translate them, which of course is huge for us, because we're not reading the Bible in Greek, correct? Or in Hebrew. We're reading it in English almost exclusively. And they wouldn't have had an issue with that because they did the same thing. Well, some of the people that are big in Judaism are people you already know. I'm probably not going to shock you with any of these names, but we'll just remind ourselves. Abraham is where it all starts. As you know, in the book of Genesis, Abraham is called by God to go to the Promised Land, where he is told that you will be a great nation, that your descendants will be as numerous as the sand of the sea and the stars in the sky and all of that. And of course also that the land I am sending to you will belong to your descendants forever. And so it begins with Abraham, and therefore the Jewish people, trace their lineage back to Abraham, as do the people, again, these words are used sometimes interchangeably, the Israelites, the Hebrews, all descendants of Abraham in that sense. So he begins with Abraham, and then Moses is huge in the history of Judaism, because the books that he is credited with, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Tanakh, are the legal system. They're actually the religion of Judaism. Before the time of Moses, there are people practicing the faith of Abraham. They're worshiping the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but not with the system that becomes Judaism, with all of the regulations and sacrifices and festivals and all of the things that you would say, that's Judaism. That all begins with Moses when they bring them up out of Egypt. They go to Sinai, and he is given the law, and that establishes the religion. And of course, Moses is famous for bringing the people up out of Egypt. If there is a Jewish Mount Rushmore, it obviously has Abraham on it. It obviously has Moses on it, and it definitely has David on it as well, as the ideal king, the second king of Israel, the one whose dynasty is connected to the prophecies of the Messiah. And so therefore, obviously, there is great prominence for him in that. And because, of course, the promises that he receives from God in the Tanakh, in the Jewish scriptures, that he will have a dynasty that lasts forever. And then the typical of the prophets is Elijah. One of the greatest of the prophets, one of the most revered. But the prophets have a big piece in the history of Judaism and in the religion itself, because they're the ones that mediate between God and man. You guys are screwing this up. This is what you need to change. That's almost always their message, right? Yeah, fix this, please. And so Elijah typifies that, of course, his prominence in the scriptures there. So we know some of the primary people. We're familiar with them as Christians. What about the practices? What about the things that they do? The Sabbath is one of the big ones, otherwise known as Shabbat. Shabbat is the day of rest, and it is observed by Jews 52 weeks a year, every year with no exception. It begins, and you might not know this part of it, on Friday at sundown. It's not a 12 o'clock thing with them. That's a modern thing. When the sun goes down, the day is over, right? Back in the ancient world, because candles are expensive, oil lamps are expensive, you go to bed when the sun goes down, in part because you also were working since the sun came up, and you're exhausted, and you need to go to bed. And so the Sabbath begins on sundown Friday, and then it ends on sundown Saturday. It is celebrated, of course, because God commanded it and because of the story of Genesis. On the seventh day he rested and hallowed it and made it holy. So it is often celebrated by the lighting of candles, the reciting of a variety of blessings, and a little meal. If you've seen Schindler's List, and you should see Schindler's List, it's one of the most important movies ever made, there is a celebration of Shabbat there. That's one of the things they are doing in one of the scenes, lighting the candles and saying some prayers. And of course, we know that work, with few exceptions, is forbidden on the Sabbath. And that is one of the things that are in the Talmud, the commentaries. What is work? How much work is too much work? What are the exceptions to the rule? If my ox falls in a ditch, can I get it out on Saturday, or do I have to wait till Sunday? Right? And Jesus in the Gospels gets in on that conversation, right? And says, you guys don't understand the purpose of the Sabbath. And so there was an ongoing discussion by the rabbis about what exactly the Sabbath means. How far can you walk on the Sabbath? And a variety of other questions, both great and small, related to it. One of the other things associated with Judaism is kosher, keeping kosher, the dietary laws. And it's simpler than the description. You can only eat mammals that have a split hoof that chews a cud. And you might be thinking, okay, which ones are those? But the long story short, you don't eat pigs. That makes it a little simpler. And you can only eat things in the sea that have fins and scales. So in other words, no shellfish, lobster, crab, none of that. And one other thing that most people don't know quite as well is that you don't have your meat and your dairy together. And the chart on the left there is showing how you make your kitchen kosher to do that. 2 separate ovens, 2 separate sinks, 2 separate set of utensils, because you never want the things that touch the meat to touch the dairy. There's a piece in the law that says do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. And that was interpreted by the rabbis over the centuries to say we don't let meat and dairy together. So if you have Jewish friends at some point and you invite them over for a barbecue, don't make them cheeseburgers, right? That would be not keeping kosher. And there's plenty of jokes like in Seinfeld or like in a variety of movies about Jewish people in America that are eating cheeseburgers and that sort of thing and violating kosher. It's a running gag in some of those. And so a lot of people know about kosher. We talked about last week that the Seventh-day Adventists also, many of them keep kosher. Circumcision, of course, is one we know about. Now it is part of a religious ceremony known as a bris. On the 8th day of the newborn Jewish boy's life, he's giving his name, and a moil, a guy that is licensed by the religious authorities to do the ceremony, will perform it. It's a big celebration in a Jewish family, an observant Jewish family, and of course many Jewish families, even if they're not overly religious, will still have the circumcision ceremony. Because it's traditional. Of course, it is an initiation rite, one that God gave Abraham and said, all of your descendants will do this. One of the things that we've discovered through archaeology and study of history is that the Israelites were not the only ones that did circumcision. We've found evidence of it in Egypt and other places where other cultures at the time of Abraham were also practicing circumcision. For a variety of their own reasons, but this is something that God said, we're doing this. And of course, they still do that to this day. And then one that is modern, and that is the bar mitzvah. Or if you are more in the mainstream among Judaism, also the bat mitzvah. Bar mitzvah is for a boy, bat mitzvah for a girl. It means son of the commandment, bar mitzvah, or daughter of the commandment would be bat mitzvah. It's an initiation into adulthood. When a boy is 13, they say, today you have become a man. You can take your place in the synagogue. You can take part in the religious ceremonies. You are part of the community. Now, I always think that it's fascinating that for girls, they do it at 12. And if they were trying to be real, they would say girls 12, boys 17, right? When you reach maturity and are capable of taking your place. But they do 12 and 13. And the thing that often gets made fun of is that the boy in particular has to read from the Tanakh in Hebrew. And it's not just reading, it's melodic singing. All right? Men, remember when you were 13. Did you want to stand up in front of a group of people and recite something that is hard to do loudly and sing it? Right? That's where the voice goes, and you get the cracking. Oh, it can be horrid. So many a Jewish boy is terrified of the bar mitzvah for that reason. But it is a modern celebration. This is something that the modern practice of Judaism has added. It's not in the law. It's not commanded by Moses. But it's something that has become important because of the fact that there is no longer any temple. And the people are spread out across the globe, most of them. Well, what about synagogues? Synagogues are where you go to worship in Judaism. The equivalent, of course, then of the Christian church or the Jewish mosque or the Hindu temple. It's the place that you worship. We see in the first century in the Gospels that there were synagogues in Capernaum and other places that Jesus visited, and they had services there. We don't know exactly where in history this idea of the local synagogue really gets going, but we know that by the first century there were a number of them in basically all the Jewish communities. They had them in Rome, they had them in Alexandria, they had them in Athens. Any place there was a Jewish community, they had synagogues. And so that becomes much, much greater in the life of Judaism once the temple is destroyed. because we can no longer look to the leadership of the temple, the priests there, the Sanhedrin. We can no longer look to them for guidance, right? We don't go there for pilgrimage anymore. We don't go there for Passover anymore or any of the other high holy days. Everything of the religious life is now in the local synagogue. And so it becomes much, much more important in modern Judaism than, of course, before. Another person important in Judaism that you would probably know is the rabbi. These are the teachers. That is their primary requirement, is to be able to teach the Torah, to teach the law of Moses to their people. If you are an Orthodox Jew, only men can be rabbis. The other two branches of Judaism allow women. After the destruction of the temple, of course, rabbis become more important because they run the local synagogue, and there are no longer that priestly class in Judaism that is sort of like a supreme court, like the people that are going to resolve the important disputes and give the big teachings. They're not there anymore. All right, and so the local rabbi is basically on his own. He's got to shepherd this flock through all the ups and downs of being a people in exile. Of course, you know about the importance of Jerusalem. This is a useful picture because of what it shows us. As you know, it's known as the city of David. It is the capital of the ancient kingdom of Israel. It was made the capital in David's day, really in Solomon's day, or in Saul's day into David's day, and it contains sites that are sacred to Judaism, obviously, sites that are sacred to Christianity, like the site of the crucifixion, the site of the resurrection, and to Islam. And there is where we have the problem. All three monotheistic religions find a reason to value Jerusalem more than any other piece of land in the world, except for, of course, the exception in Islam with Mecca. So it's important to all, but sharing has not really been popular. There have been issues. We can't all play nice. If you look at this picture, in the middle, in the background, is the Dome of the Rock, the noble sanctuary, the second holiest shrine in Islam, believed to be the place, and we'll get to this later, where Muhammad ascended into heaven. But of course, they also believe that in there is the rock upon which Abraham was supposed to have sacrificed Isaac had he gone through with it. So it has great significance. It's right in the middle of the temple grounds where Solomon's temple once stood and where Herod's temple stood. So that area on top where on the right you see trees, on the left you see the mosque, that's the Temple Mount. The sacred temple of Judaism used to stand there. Not anymore, right? The Romans destroyed it. All that is left for the Jews is this wall known as the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall. That's a foundation wall. And I'll show you a closer up picture before, but you can see it's just a small little space that pilgrims can come to. They are not allowed on the Temple Mount. If you are a Jewish radical, one of those people that wants to rebuild the temple and throw out the Muslims, if you tried to go on the Temple Mount, you will start a riot. All right, there was some issue previously, I believe it was Shimon Peres or one of the other Jewish politicians was trying to say, well, I'm going up on the Temple Mount. If you want to start a war, then go up on the Temple Mount. Because that's going to get a reaction from Jordan and Saudi Arabia and Iraq and everybody. And so it's a major issue, and that land, that real estate has changed hands a ton of times in history in terms of who controlled it. Obviously, the Crusaders controlled it for a while, and at that time it was a church on top. When the Muslims took it back, it went back to being a mosque. The Wailing Wall itself is all that remains of the temple. Because when the Romans destroyed it in 70 AD, they literally pushed every stone off the foundation, because it goes down on the sides. They just shoved them all off and said, that's what we're leaving you. The revolt against Rome that started in 66 didn't end well. That's the one that ends with Masada, right, with all the Jews on the fortress in the desert committing suicide rather than being Roman slaves. If you are in the Israeli Defense Forces, one of the things that you do before you begin serving is you go to Masada. You make a pilgrimage to Masada and say, this is what happens when we can't defend ourselves. It's a very powerful thing, but this is all that's left. And so Messianic Jews, Jews that are waiting for the Messiah to come, that are waiting for rebuilding the temple, they go to the Wailing Wall. And you've probably seen pictures of people pushing pieces of paper into the cracks. They put their prayers on there because they think that it's such a holy site. Maybe God's listening if I put it there. So this is a flashpoint because in the past, Arab Muslim youth in particular have thrown rocks down from above onto the Jews below, and it's been a problem. All right, because they're feet apart, not miles apart, feet apart. And if you don't get along, that is an issue, right? Remember when you were in the back seat with your siblings years ago? When you're stuck there, doesn't always work well. Well, these groups are stuck there and they don't always get along. Three main groups in Judaism, in modern Judaism: Orthodox, Conservative, and Reformed. And they're quite different. The Orthodox on the left in the picture, you can often tell them by their dress. You might, if you didn't know better, mistake them for Amish or Quakers or something. Very similar in their dress, actually. They are the most traditional, very similar in that as well. They say, we are the Judaism of Abraham and Moses. We won't change a thing. That's their mantra. We do everything the way it was in the law. In England, about half of the Jews are Orthodox, very common. In Israel, it's about a quarter, but that quarter is extremely powerful in Israeli politics because they're the ones that can throw the balance one way or another between one government and another. So they get a lot of privilege and they get their way a lot in Israeli politics today because they're a solid bloc, even though there's only 25% of them. But in the United States, it's only 13%. It's the smallest group of the three. So you will not, there's some large Orthodox communities in places like New York, but other places you're not going to see a lot of Orthodox Jews in America. Conservative Jews are the ones in the middle. All right, they say, well, we'll update some stuff. We're not going to be as ancient as the Orthodox. We're not going to do everything the way of the Orthodox, but we still think these rituals are important. We're kind of going to update them for the modern world, but we still want to hold on to Judaism and what it is. They're the second largest group in the United States, but outside of the United States, there's very few Jews in the middle. Outside of the United States, your average Jewish person is either going to be Orthodox or Reform, or of course nothing, but very few people that are kind of splitting the difference. Reformed are the ones that basically are saying that what matters with Judaism is ethics. Well, what is the essence of the law, right? Do unto others. What is the true purpose of it? Don't get caught up in the rituals. Don't get caught up. We don't even necessarily think they're all that important. And many Reformed would have sort of pushed the rituals to the side while trying to say we're about the ethics, which is an interesting choice. And that is the largest group in the United States, about a third. So if you're going to run into someone who is Jewish in the United States who practices Judaism, the odds are they're probably Reformed, more concerned with the ethics than the rituals. Okay? So those three groups don't always get along, of course, because the Orthodox think everybody else is lazy, and the Reformed probably think the Orthodox are a little bit nutty. We might see the similar things within Christianity, right? Where we've got some difference of opinion on such things. Well, what about the diaspora? And this is a fascinating map. 12.5 million, and this is a couple of years old, so the numbers, of course, always are changing. 12.5 million Jews live outside of Israel, which is more than live in Israel. We'll get to that number in a minute. But notice the numbers in Europe. 430,000. There's a reason for that. The Nazis took care of making those numbers about 7 million lower than they would have been. By today, that number might be 8 or 9 million in Europe had that not happened. But in North America, we've got 2.5 million, which is big. But I bet you most people don't know that the largest group of Jews outside of Israel are in Brazil. Nearly 6 million. South America, 8.5 million. Africa, it's a few 100,000. Australia, a few 100,000. The Arab world, a few 100,000. Asia, almost none. So most of the Jews in the world today live in Israel, America, or South America. Okay? Well, how did we get those dramatically lower numbers? It is an ugly story, and one that does not begin with the Holocaust, one that ends with the Holocaust. And you can't understand what happens at the Holocaust during World War II if you understand that that was a long time coming. It began in particular in the Middle Ages. Within Christendom, during the Middle Ages, there began to be anti-Jewish riots. And these riots often began during the Christian Passion plays. During the Holy Week in the Middle Ages, for the education of the people, right? Most people can't read. We put on plays. We will demonstrate the passion of Christ, and we will act it out. And that acting it out involves a few scenes that had the crowd, by the end of it, thinking they murdered our Lord. They're the ones that did it. And so after seeing the Passion play, oftentimes a crowd, a mob, would go to the synagogue and burn it down or beat people up. Probably not what Jesus was hoping for by a reenactment of his suffering, correct? But that's where people's minds went. Actually, during the Crusades, we have the first recorded large-scale incidents of Christians murdering Jews in cold blood. That was as the response to a crusade. On their way to go recapture the Holy Land in Germany, they decided, well, let's take it out on them here as well, unfortunately. And then you have, throughout the Middle Ages towards the modern era, you have periodic expulsions of the Jewish people from Spain, from Italy, from France, from England. Every once in a while, the king would say, you all need to get out. All right. Now, of course, that's famous when it happened in Spain after the Reconquest, when they kicked out both the Muslims and the Jews. But it happened in other countries, and there's one fascinating reason why. The Jewish people in the Middle Ages were the bankers, for a very good reason. In Christendom, it was illegal to charge usury to another Christian. If you wanted to lend somebody money as a Christian who was a fellow Christian, you couldn't charge interest. How many people want to go into banking if you can't charge interest? You just give your money, and if they don't repay, oh well. That's not a recipe for being in business very long. But the people who could charge interest were the Jews, because they didn't have a law that said you can't charge non-Jews interest. And so they developed banking networks. Now, who are the biggest creditors in the Middle Ages and in the early Renaissance of banks? Kings. Because who needs to spend more money than kings? Wars are very expensive. The Spanish monarchs, even though they had all that money coming from the gold and silver mines in America, they defaulted on their loans again and again and again. And so if a European monarch was deep in debt to, say, the banking family of Paris or whatever, he would say, you know, I could just kick them all out. Then I don't have to repay my loan. So there are issues. Oftentimes it's just pure anti-Semitism, but sometimes there was another motive as well. And so you had that happening. And then, of course, famously, you have the Spanish Inquisition, where basically all the Muslims and Jews in Spain, after the land was reconquered under Ferdinand and Isabella, they were told, convert, die. Which one do you want? Convert, die, take a choice. And many, of course, of the Jews converted, but didn't mean it, and then they later left. It was a whole mess. And then, as time goes on, you keep having these pogroms, you keep having these outbursts of violence in Russia, in France, here, there, and everywhere. You eventually end up at the culmination of where that was eventually headed, of course, and that's the Holocaust. During World War II, now we blame the Nazis, but a very important book was written a couple decades ago called Hitler's Willing Executioners. And the researchers there showed that it was not just diehard SS troops and the Gestapo and whatnot that were killing Jews. They were Poles, French, Italians, Spaniards, average, everyday people, right? Who betrayed Anne Frank? Was it Nazis? No, neighbors. The average person that contributed to the final solution that the Nazis were going for was just a regular person in Europe that would have called themselves a Christian. That's scarier, all right? That's a worse version of the history than just saying, oh, those Nazis, bad Nazis. Because it says a whole lot of people that had either no problem with it or were happily participating. There is so much evidence that people were turning on their neighbors and showing where they were hiding or pointing them out to the SS so that they could be killed. It's disturbing, not to say the least. As again, I said, watch Schindler's List. It's so powerful. At least 6 million Jews were killed by the Nazis, along with, of course, Russian prisoners of wars, Jehovah's Witnesses, people that had mental illnesses, people of all that they didn't like, undesirables in great numbers. This cannot be denied. Now, it is denied, but not with any shred of truth, of course. The evidence is completely overwhelming. I have been to a Nazi concentration camp. I went to Germany and went to Dachau. It is not cool. You stand there and you can feel that this is a place where evil happened. And there's the sign there, work will make you free, that you've probably seen, which of course was the lie they told them. If you keep working, you'll live. And that obviously was not the long-term plan of the Nazis. They shot Jews, but then they realized something fascinating. After an SS soldier or another soldier shoots about 150 people in the back of the head, they tend to go insane. Imagine that. And so they said, well, we can't do that. We got to protect our soldiers. And of course, it's inefficient. And so they put them in concentration camps and said, well, we'll just feed them a starvation diet, enough to keep them working, but over time they'll die. And that killed many, many, many. But then they said, that's not fast enough. They said, we got to figure something out. So they tried putting them in the back of cars and putting the exhaust into it. But said, oh my gosh, we have a gas shortage. We can't do that. And they eventually came up with Zyklon B, right? The industrial pesticide, put it in the quote-unquote showers, sent a batch of people in when they arrived at the concentration camp, said, take a shower, everybody gets undressed, gets ready for the shower, here comes the gas, they're all dead, and then another group of prisoners takes them out and throws them in the burial pit or in the crematorium. Had time been given to them, there would have been no Jews left in Europe except for one here and one there. It was almost too late as it is when the Americans and the Russians showed up. I actually had a fascinating opportunity. I wasn't necessarily going to tell this story, but I'm thinking of it right now. An author of one of the Holocaust survivor books came to the school I was teaching at in Michigan, and we had brought all the kids together, and she told her story and whatnot, and then asked, who's got questions? And I was like, I have so many questions. I need to ask a question. And so I asked her, because she was in one of the concentration camps in Poland. I said, did you know anything about how the war was going? Did you know that the Allies had landed in France? Did you know that the Russians were coming? And she said, we knew nothing. Until they heard the Russian artillery, they didn't know that there was any hope. They didn't know that the Nazis were losing at all because they kept it as business as usual until the day they ran away from the camp, right? They just keep and one of the reasons, if you really want to look at the weird cynicism of history, one of the reasons the Nazis lost the war is because they diverted so much material and time and money and effort into trying to kill all the Jews off. Had they utilized them as labor, had they utilized the Russian prisoners of war as labor instead of trying to kill them all, they could have at least perhaps won a stalemate. It's disturbing. Of course, they were trying to purify the gene pool, which is laughable, but they thought they had something going there. because of the Holocaust, a movement that had been building for the centuries. It began with English and American evangelicals who thought Jesus can't come back unless the Jews are in Israel. And so they were sponsoring Jews to go back to Israel, and they were pushing for support of Jews in Israel. That comes to a head in 1948. This is probably something that would not have happened if not for the massive guilt on the part of American, British, French politicians when they realized, oh, you mean our policies of not letting Jews come to America during the lead up to World War II, that had consequences, yes? Yes, it did. And so they said, oh, yes, you need a homeland. And the UN on May 14th authorized the beginning of the modern nation state of Israel. 4 countries that neighbored Israel declared war the very next day. And so Israel as a country, modern Israel, began in war. And many observers thought they had no chance, but of course they won. And that was followed in 1967 by the Six-Day War, which was a resounding success for the Israelite army. It was a preemptive war. They saw that the other nations were getting ready, and they said, yeah, we're not just going to wait, and they struck first. 1973 is the Yom Kippur War, which almost was a complete disaster. It was a close thing because most of the army was at home for Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the Jewish holy day, and they were attacked during it, which is, you know, not very nice, but what happened? Israel today has about 8.6 million people, so that's less than the diaspora, right? More people living outside of Israel than in Israel. Of course, it's a very small country. 75% of the people are Jewish, but a significant minority of the people living in Israel are Arabs. It is a democracy like ours, but also a representative democracy like ours. They elect representatives, but their system is parliamentary, much closer to England, which means that it makes no sense to us when we see how it works, just like ours doesn't make any sense to them. And it has the world's 35th largest GDP, which is actually quite incredible for a country so small. That is Israel today. But what about Israel in the church? Where do we stand? Well, the first thing we need to talk about is, of course, Jews and the Messiah, Judaism and the Messiah. Since the first century, the vast majority of people that are descendants of Abraham have said Jesus is not the Messiah. The vast majority didn't accept him then. Of course, Paul famously sort of trying to figure out how that could be in the book of Romans. And since then, it hasn't really changed. The 3 primary reasons would be that they were under the impression that when Messiah came, there would be a messianic age, that his coming would be a golden age. And they're like, yeah, the coming of Jesus wasn't a golden age. Remember Rome, the destruction of the temple? It was actually a pretty bad time. So they got an issue there because they think the two are connected, or have to be connected. Secondly, many people within Judaism would reject the ancestry that's in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke. They would say that that's not right. He's not really a descendant of David. And then thirdly, they would say that passages like Isaiah 7:14 and Isaiah 53 mean something different. The age-old argument about what Isaiah meant when he said the virgin will conceive, that's not one that you're unfamiliar with. And then after the Christians started saying that the suffering servant in Isaiah 53 was Jesus, they said, no, it's the people. It's a metaphor. It's a metaphor for the suffering of the people, which of course the people are suffering, so that seemed plausible. But that was a sort of a response to Christians citing Isaiah 53. And of course, to this day, many of the most orthodox, many of the most fervent Jewish practicers of Judaism are expecting the Messiah to come. And there have been a number of false messiahs that have come, and people got excited, and then it didn't happen. And there are people that are Orthodox that live in Israel today that have recreated all the little implements of the temple, and they're just waiting for the day to rebuild it because they believe it's going to happen. And of course, you know that if they start rebuilding the temple, that means war, massive war, perhaps World War III, which, you know, is not good. And so that is the state of Judaism with the Messiah. Well, what about Judaism and the church? How have we been doing with them? The primary thing that we have to understand is we've got two different covenants. We've got an old covenant and a new covenant. The old covenant is the covenant of Abraham, the covenant of David. And the correct interpretation of that from a Christian perspective is that that covenant remains in effect. It was given to Abraham, it was given to David, and it wasn't conditional. And therefore, it belongs to the Jewish people, not to the church. The church has a different covenant, one established by Jesus. We call it the New Covenant, and it's for all nations, not just the Jewish people. Now, there is disagreement in some avenues within Christianity about that. There are some people who every time they read Israel in the Old Testament, they substitute the word church for any promise. Promises of blessings, promises of anything. Oh, those are now ours. Those are ours. You can't have them anymore. They've been transferred. And I humbly submit that that is a misunderstanding of Paul's explanation that we are the branch grafted in. Bigger topic for a different time, but we need to understand the issue with the covenants. And of course, in church history, there has been a significant amount of animosity, a significant amount of violence between people who call themselves Christians and official members of the church leadership against a variety of Jewish people, and that's not good. And then, of course, things changed after the Holocaust. It was building up to that point, but after the Holocaust, now there is a very vocal, particularly evangelical focus of support for the state of Israel, particularly in America, but in other European countries as well amongst evangelicals. In much of that is from people who believe that, well, that's helping get the second coming going, just like our ancestors believed that same thing in the 19th century. Let's highlight those differences, all right? Christianity says Jesus of Nazareth, he's the Messiah. The people that follow Judaism have said, no, that's a big difference. Christianity says Jesus is the Son of God. He's part of this thing we're calling the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Judaism says, no, he's not. There is no Trinity. There's just God, one. Christianity says this whole thing's about faith. It's a grace thing. It's something that is built upon what Jesus did for us, whereas the traditional, normal understanding of Judaism is that what we really need to do is keep the law. It's all about keeping the law. If you keep the law, you're therefore a good Jew and a good follower of Judaism, you'll be fine. And of course, a massive difference is that Christianity emphasizes evangelism, right? It was born in evangelism and has always been about evangelism, whereas Judaism has almost none of that in its history. Whether ancient or modern Judaism, there are not Jewish missionaries going out there trying to convert the Gentiles to Judaism. That's just not something they've ever felt the need to do. Islam and Christianity were very much in that mold, but they said, no, that's not us. So what gets in the way, right? You're trying to share the gospel with someone who's Jewish. Well, they got an issue with Jesus, and we really can't find middle ground there. You say he's the Son of God, the Messiah, the Savior of the world. They say, no, no, no. That doesn't fit. Secondly, of course, anti-Semitism. And the biggest problem of anti-Semitism is that the majority of the people committing anti-Semitism say they're Christians. My 2 cents worth? They're not. It's almost impossible for me to understand how you could be an anti-Semite and a Christian. The heart is not right. But anyway, we'll leave that alone for a moment. And then lastly, of course, a lot of Christians are confused. How does the church in Israel fit? What's our connection? If someone is Jewish and they accept Jesus, are they still supposed to keep kosher? Are they still supposed to obey the Sabbath? Do you have answers for those? Do you understand what those answers are based upon? I mean, it can be confusing. And so if you're not sure what you're asking them to do, how are they supposed to know? So it can be an issue. So let's pause for a moment. We've got one more to go. Let's see if we've got questions about Judaism that we need to clarify, and if not, we'll move on to Islam. Gives me an excuse to get a drink. All right. So you know a lot about Judaism, and now you know a lot about Islam. You might not have known a lot about Islam in the 1990s or the 80s if you were alive then, but you do now. People have been talking about Islam a lot. What is, then, Islam? In its simplest sense, Islam is a noun. In the language of Arabic, it means submission. And one who submits to Islam is a Muslim, which is another noun in Arabic. So those two words are, of course, related. They're both from Arabic. One is the submission itself, and the other is the one who submits. That's a big theme in Islam, the idea of submission. And we'll see why. Who's Allah? You've heard that word. Allah is just the generic word in Arabic for God. You may have heard a few years ago there was a controversy with a translation group that was printing Bibles in Arabic. And some American Christians got upset with them because in the Arabic Bible, God is Allah. And they were saying, you can't call God Allah. That's their God, not our God. But there's not another word in Arabic. It's the word for God, right? Just like in the Old Testament, sometimes when the word God is there, Elohim, it's not talking about Yahweh. It's talking about the gods of the Ammonites or the god of the Egyptians. It's just a word. So that was a fascinating controversy that actually was unfortunately wrong-footed. Because if you're going to witness to people who speak Arabic, that's the word to use. You're going to have to obviously explain to them that the Allah I'm talking about is not the same as the Allah that you know. Muhammad. Everybody's heard of Muhammad. Muhammad lived from 570 to 630 AD, so about a quarter of the way closer to us than Jesus. He was born in the city of Mecca, which is in Saudi Arabia, and he said, I had a supernatural vision. The angel Gabriel came to me, and he gave me this revelation. I received it from him. Muhammad said, I did not write the Quran. I got it from him. Now, that's the same thing that Joseph Smith said about the tablets that he found, right? That he found them and translated them. He didn't write them. Now, so if you are a Muslim, a follower of Islam, you don't view Muhammad as the author of the Quran. He is just the one who is the conduit for it, because they believe the Quran is eternal, that it is the Word of God that has always existed. And so that is a fascinating piece of understanding it. The message of the Quran that was given by Muhammad was what we call pure monotheism. The word for it in Islam is tawheed. And this is monotheism with no ifs, ands, or buts in it. In his life, Muhammad had to flee Mecca because he came with this message, and the local merchants that made a lot of money from idolatry said, get out of here with this. And he fled. It's known as the Hijrah. It's a pilgrimage. It's a holy thing. He went to Medina, but he came back. One of the key differences between Muhammad and Jesus is that Muhammad was a warrior. He fought in at least 3 major battles in his life. It influences his role in the religion. In 630, only 2 years before he died, they recaptured Mecca and established that religion there. Muhammad is viewed by Muslims as the paragon of virtue for all time. If you want to find what a virtuous man looks like, it's Muhammad. And so they have basically enshrined 7th century Arabic culture as the ethics for all time. And so you might have scratched your head over the years about the way Islam treats women, or its ideas about this or that, and think these feel like they're from ancient times, and they would say absolutely, because this was the ethics in Muhammad's day, and we're going to keep it that way forever. All right, kind of like our friends in the Amish have said, we are freezing the world in the 19th century or the 18th century. Stop it there. Don't let it keep going. I like it here. Well, that's what they're doing. 7th century Arab culture is the culture. So if it was good for them, it's good for us. If it was wrong for them, it's wrong for us. It's very simple in that. In order to be a good Muslim, you need to follow the 5 pillars. The 5 pillars begin with the Shahada, which is the exclamation, there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger. But it doesn't count in English. It only truly counts if you say it in Arabic. And the act of sincerely saying the Shahada in Arabic is what makes you a Muslim. Ta-da, you're a Muslim. They actually have like ceremonies sometimes for a convert. Say it publicly in Arabic, you're in. You might have heard the news stories when Boko Haram was executing people, if that's the right group, I don't want to get my groups messed up, in the mall in Kenya. They were known to have asked, say the Shahada. And if you couldn't say it in Arabic, right? Because if you're a Muslim at all, you can say it in Arabic. It's more basic to them than the Lord's Prayer is to us. I mean, how regular a Christian are you if you can't at least stumble your way through the Lord's Prayer, right? Means you haven't been to church very much. And so if you can't say the Shahada in Arabic, then get out of here. So that is basic. That's starting point. That's go. That's where you start. The second one is the Salah, the prayers. 5 times a day, right? Every day. Drop what you're doing, face east towards Mecca, get on your prayer rug and pray. Great example from that in pop culture, probably not the most accurate, but one that you can easily see is from the Kevin Costner Robin Hood movie, where he's in England saying, which way is east? There's no sun in England, which is a funny joke about the weather in England. I can't pray towards Mecca. The third one is the zakat, alms for the poor, 2.5%. Everybody's supposed to give them. The fourth one is the Hajj, and I'll talk more about that one in a minute. That's the pilgrimage to Mecca. Everybody's supposed to take it before you die. And then fifth is fasting during the month of Ramadan. You're not supposed to eat or drink from sunrise to sunset, which of course is a big imposition to some of the professional athletes that are Muslims. Not an easy thing to compete when you don't have anything. They actually have an app now that will tell you when the sun is down so that you can have a glass of water and eat something. The modern world. So those are the 5 things. That's it in a nutshell. Do those 5, you're a good Muslim. Don't do them, you're not. Ta-da. All right, that's boiled down, right? Judaism, the law, there's hundreds of them. It's complicated. This, put it on a card, everybody can learn it. About the Hajj, about the pilgrimage. This is the Kaaba. It is a box in the most sacred site in Islam, the mosque, the Al-Masjid Al-Haram in Mecca, Saudi Arabia. And people come there every year for the Hajj, and you work your way in circles, walking around, getting closer and closer and closer till you get next to the Kaaba, and then you work your way back out. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia gains most of its legitimacy in Islam because they are the controllers of Mecca and Medina. They're the gateways to the Hajj. And they are currently letting in less Muslims per year than they need to for all Muslims to be able to do the Hajj. It's mathematically impossible. There are more Muslims in the world today than can get into Saudi Arabia to do the Hajj on a given year before they die. So a vast number will never be able to get there. Even if they could afford it, they couldn't get the visa, they couldn't get in. It's a fascinating thing. And they have had many times where there has been a stampede, or where there has been a panic, or a bridge that collapsed, or something like that. And those are massive black eyes for the kings of Saudi Arabia, because controlling this city is huge. The Quran, you might have seen it spelled K-O-R-A-N. The more respectful spelling is this one, Q-U-R apostrophe A-N. The Quran is the book that Muhammad left behind. Some interesting facts about it. It's only half as long as the New Testament. Thin, really. 14% as long as the Bible. So it's just a little book. It's not, and this can be difficult, arranged chronologically from early to latest. It's actually arranged very differently by how long the chapters are. The longest chapters are first, the shortest chapters are last. But that means if you read it from front to back, the story goes back and forth, back and forth. You can actually online find a list, what's the proper order to read it in, so the story makes sense. But it was from one author in one time in one place. Very different from the Bible, which has many authors over a long period of time in not just one place, but a larger geographic place. So that we would say, well, this is a book written by Paul, and that means something a little bit different than something written by James. Or this is from Isaiah, and that's a little bit different than what was from Daniel. We would recognize God as the ultimate author of all, but we care about the author. They don't care about that, because the author is meaningless because he's not the author. He's just the guy that wrote it down. He's just the stenographer. So you don't ask a Muslim, what was the author's intent here? That means nothing. That's a crazy question. There's a lot on this page. I'll boil it down. The people of the book. That's what they call Jews and Christians. The book. Because we share some of that sacred literature. They believe that God revealed himself to both Jews and Christians. Abraham, that's legit. Moses is legit. And Jesus is legit. They believe Jesus is one of the greatest prophets. And so they, in theory, and I have to say that, accept both the Jewish scriptures and the Christian scriptures, because we had prophets. They, of course, would put the Quran above them, superseding them, much like the Mormons would put the Book of Mormon above the Bible, but they claim that God was speaking in both of those settings. The Dhimmi are non-Muslims living in Islamic countries, and they are supposed to be given a degree of legal protection as people of the book. Under Sharia law, they are supposed to have their life, property, freedom of religion respected. They have to pay a tax, an extra tax, known as the jizya, but it's kind of like your tax that you pay in order to not be a Muslim. That's kind of like they figured that was fair. And you couldn't do everything in society. You couldn't hold high public office, couldn't necessarily get into this university or that kind of thing. But they're supposed to be treated well. And history shows both times when that was kept and times when it wasn't. It depends on what you're looking at. So in theory, the law in the Quran protects both Christians and Muslims if they're living in a Muslim country. Or, excuse me, Christians and Jews. We talked about Jewish rabbis. Now we're talking about Muslim imams. These are the men primarily worship leaders, more than scholars per se, but some of the imams are important scholars. Shia Islam elevates the imam more than Sunni Islam does, if that helps. So the history. The top map is 632 AD, during when Muhammad died. They control part of Saudi Arabia, modern-day Yemen. Not much. You've got the Byzantines in purple. You've got the Sassanids to the east. Two big, powerful empires. 100 years later, the Sassanids are gone, and the Byzantines are kicked out of North Africa and parts of Asia Minor, but all of Palestine. Those places had been Christian for 500 years, parts of it. In 100 years. And of course, all of Spain. And they actually fought a battle in France, the Battle of Poitiers, which turned back the Islamic armies and sort of made the Pyrenees the border. But that is a remarkable expansion, and it's by conquest. All right, the conversions happened later, over several generations, when people, I think, mostly said, we could keep being Christians, but we're not getting ahead in society. It's costing us a little bit. And over time, those numbers plummeted. Of course, as a Christian living in a Muslim country, you can't proselytize. So if you lose one, then they're lost for good. And if you ever convert to Islam, you can't be converted back. So over time, the numbers just dwindled, and of course some people left. And so those became Muslim countries, but like especially Egypt, North Africa, Turkey. They weren't, of course, at when it began. Which leads to this discussion of jihad. You've heard of jihad, I know that. It simply means the struggle in Arabic. It can mean warfare against unbelievers. That's the way you hear it most commonly. Some of the Muslim scholars use it instead for the inward struggle. My struggle against temptation, my jihad against my own greed or against my own lust. Now, you could probably translate that properly into English as either holy war or crusade. Those terms both fit. Those are pretty much what they're talking about. If you are involved in jihad, that makes you a mujahid. You probably heard the term mujahideen, right? If you remember the 1980s, anybody alive? Remember the 1980s? The mujahideen in Afghanistan. Who was giving them Stinger missiles and guns? The CIA, the Americans, because they were on our side against the Russians. Didn't last. Yesterday's freedom fighters are today's terrorists. That's kind of the way history sometimes goes. That's where we're most familiar with that term. The other thing you need to know is the Wahhabi movement, which is now well known, but it began in the 18th century, a very strict interpretation of Islam that began in the Arabian Peninsula. It is supported by the Kingdom of Saud, in part as sort of a compact. You don't challenge our legitimacy as kings, and we'll give you money for your schools. It's an interesting trade-off, but it has spread to much of the Islamic world, and of course, we have seen the armed struggle that has happened against Christians, but also against other Muslims. As often as not, the people being killed by Islamic fundamentalists are fellow Muslims that they consider to be heretics, whether they're Shiites or another group that's not strict enough. Sunni versus Shiite. This is a dispute that goes back to the very beginning. After Muhammad died, there was a question, well, who's in charge now? Right? And one group said, well, it has to be one of his descendants. And the other group said, no, we're going to choose the person who should be in charge, and we need to choose the right person, et cetera, et cetera. Hereditary versus choice, right? The followers that said, hey, it's his descendants, they had a big blow because Hussein ibn Ali, his grandson, and all of his family were murdered after the Battle of Karbala by one of the early caliphs. One of the early leaders that was chosen that was given that position because they were chosen. So that side won early on. The Shiites are the ones that are still claiming to follow the descendants of Muhammad. The Sunnis are the ones that took the other path. And nowadays they're quite different. They do things, their ceremonies, their practices, their traditions, their customs, they're very different. To us, you wouldn't know the difference, right? But to them, it's night and day. It's like saying you're an Englishman, right? And having to go and say, no, I'm Welsh, or I'm Scottish. What you call me an Englishman, right? And you're like, oh, 6 of one, half dozen the other. Not to them. They're very different. They know why they're different. Well, Sunni and Shiite are very different. And all Muslims say the Quran is from God, but our interpretation of it is very different. And that's where it becomes. This map is the best one I could find. It's a little confusing because of the colors they chose. The Shiites are the orange, or that's not orange, it's the brown that's in Iran, here in this part. So it's kind of that right there, and then part of Iraq, which of course has been a problem in the last decade and a half. And then this little bit right down here. Anybody heard of the war that's going on in Yemen? Those are Saudi Arabian troops that are Sunni versus Shiite rebels in Yemen. It's the same fight that's been going on since the beginning. The Iraq-Iran war was, yes, Saddam Hussein wanted the land, and yes, it was territorial in power, but he was using the hatred these two groups have for each other. 90% of the Muslims in the world are Sunnis. So they are winning the number race. Less than 10% Shiite. And this is the thing most Americans don't have a good grasp on. Less than 20% of the Muslims in the world are Arabs. The vast majority are non-Arab Sunnis. If you want to find the most Muslims, you go to Indonesia, an Asian country, way over there, on the other side of India, north of Australia. That's where most of the world's Muslims live. This map will show you that. The largest Muslim country in the world is Indonesia, 88%, 200 million. Second is Pakistan, 96%. That's a lot, 174 million. India is third, even though it's only 13%. You got more than a billion people in India, so 13% gets you to 160 million. Bangladesh is fourth. We're not in the Middle East yet. We're in the subcontinent of India or Southeast Asia. That's where the majority, the vast majority of the world's Muslims live, in India, in its subcontinent, and in Indonesia. You don't get to the Middle East until Egypt. And Nigeria is sixth. Iran is seventh. They're not Arabs. Turkey is eighth. They're not Arabs. Algeria, 9. Morocco, 10. Now you finally get Iraq. Saudi Arabia is way down in 15th. So the idea that we have in our head that a Muslim is an Arab who lives in the Middle East is wrong on both counts. But every one of them that you've ever seen in a Hollywood production or on Homeland or on any other thing, that's what they are, right? Because they're the ones that we've had the interesting interactions with in the last 20 years. So that's what our mind says when we think Muslim. Arab from the Middle East, but they're not. And not that there aren't extremists in Indonesia or Pakistan, but it's very different. Well, what does the Quran say about Jesus? I actually decided to go with direct quotes here, okay? Right from the Quran. The Quran says Jesus is a prophet, just like Moses, Isaiah, but very clearly says there is no incarnation. Let me read these quotes. This is from chapter 1:12. Say, He is Allah, the one and only, Allah the eternal, absolute. He begetteth not, nor is He begotten, and there's none like unto Him. So the Christian idea, the only begotten Son, they say, no begetting. Ain't nobody begetting here. Specifically denies that. Chapter 4, verse 127, or 157, I guess it's a surah, but for our purposes. And this is interesting, for they're saying, indeed, we've killed the Messiah, Jesus, the son of Mary, the messenger of Allah. And they didn't kill him, nor did they crucify him. But another was made to resemble him to them. And indeed, those who differ over it are in doubt about it. They've no knowledge of it except the following of assumption, and they didn't kill him for certain. The official position of Islam is that Jesus didn't die on the cross, it was a substitute. God put somebody else in his place, made him look like Jesus. It was a trick. The Quran specifically denies it. So no begotten of the Father, no crucifixion. Of course, if there's no crucifixion, there's no resurrection, because he didn't die. Why would he come back to life if he didn't die? And then this one is extremely fascinating. 5:116 says, you all have three gods, and shirk is the unforgivable sin in Islam, to have polytheism. Of course, the Bible says we don't have three gods, we got three persons. That's not what the Quran understands. Beware the day when Allah will say, "Oh, Jesus." So Allah is asking Jesus a question. "Son of Mary, did you say to the people, 'Take me and my mother as deities beside Allah?'" He will say, "Exalted are you. It was not for me to say that which I have no right. If I'd said it, you'd have known it. You know what's within myself, and I don't know what's within yourself. Indeed, it's you who is the knower of the unseen." So the Quran has Jesus saying to Allah, "I didn't say anything of the sort." But notice who the three gods are supposed to be: Father, Son, and Mary. It's fascinating. The primary interaction that Muhammad had with Christians was in Syria. And our assumption, because of course there's no commentary on this from him, is that when he went into a Christian church, he saw, and of course this is before the iconoclastic controversy, very much with the statues and the art in the East, he saw pictures of Jesus, and he saw pictures of Mary, and he said, "Oh, those are the ones they think are God." And since there aren't like pictures of the Holy Spirit, right, maybe a dove or something, but he didn't notice that, he thought, "Oh, they think Mary is God, and Jesus and Mary and the Father." So he actually didn't understand. If you read the Quran, you realize Muhammad was rejecting a Christianity that he didn't understand, a version of Christianity that isn't actually Christianity. He probably would have rejected actual Christianity too, but he didn't understand it. So where are we on different paths? Well, of course, God in both Judaism and Christianity is what we would call intimately involved. He is here working with, through, in people, making redemption, right? Setting his plans in motion. That is not God, not Allah in the Quran. In Islam, Allah is transcendent. That is one of his most important qualities. He is above this. He's not in the business of redeeming us. He gave you the 5 pillars, you get it done. All right? You're basically on your own. You don't look to Allah to save you. That's very different than both Judaism and Christianity. Islam's fundamental belief in Tawheed, that is Unitarian monotheism, monotheism with absolutely no caveats, is very different, of course, than Christianity saying one God in 3 persons, right? Which we would call Trinitarian monotheism. So if you're a sociologist, you'd say, well, they're both monotheists. But the Muslims are going to say they aren't monotheists. They're polytheists. They're tritheists. And we would say, no, we're not. We're Trinitarian monotheists. But that's a deep discussion right there. And then, of course, Islam says, yeah, oh, Jesus is a prophet, absolutely. But he wasn't born of a virgin. He wasn't the Son of God. He didn't die on a cross. And, of course, he wasn't raised from the dead. So if you take away the virgin birth, the Son of God, the death and the cross and the resurrection from Jesus, we've pretty much taken away everything that we think is important about Jesus, other than his teaching. So we got some major differences, plus these other ones right here. In Islam, you get to heaven by the 5 pillars. It's on you. Do it. Whereas, of course, Christianity says, I can't do it, you can't do it, we can't do it. It's a Jesus did it thing. Salvation by grace. In Islam, you can't know that you're going to heaven. Because how do you know if you did it well enough, often enough, consistently enough? Unless you die as a martyr, in which case you're golden, you're good to go. Now that's not all that different than the Middle Ages in Christianity, right? In the history of Christianity during the Middle Ages, the Pope said, hey, you go to Holy Land on crusade, you die there, you die in a state of grace, you're definitely getting in. And a lot of guys with a lot of blood on their hands already said, hey, not a bad deal. I might get some money out of this, I might get some land out of this, why not? And so it had some of that same connotation. Whereas, of course, Christianity says, if you got it, you can't lose it because it's not yours. It's Jesus's. He gave it to you, and he's the one that's responsible, so it's not up to me. So then I can be assured. And then lastly, what gets in the way when you try to witness to a Muslim? And this map is showing just Christianity and Islam, and you can see that we're kind of surrounded, right? That's why we got a lot of borders in conflict. To the north with Europe, to the south with Africa, to the west with the Americas, we share in our history a lot of borderland, which of course has led to a lot of conflict. But the number one thing getting in between a Muslim and a Christian is shirk. They are being taught that the unforgivable sin is idolatry and polytheism, worshiping more than one God or worshiping idols. And they would say that our use of pictures is idols, even just like paintings of Jesus. That's idolatry. You don't paint Allah unless you want to die. And you certainly don't make a cartoon with Muhammad in it, by the way. Don't do that. So you're asking them to commit the unforgivable sin if you share the gospel with them. Much like you're asking a Mormon to commit the unforgivable sin if you're asking him to become an apostate Mormon. Same thing. Secondly, there's no crucifixion or resurrection. The Quran says it was fake, it didn't happen. Well, you say it did happen. So you're arguing about something from 2,000 years ago that they are firmly believing didn't happen. And then lastly, they believe that the Bible you're reading is corrupted. Have you heard of the critic Bart Ehrman? Bart Ehrman is an apostate. He was raised in the church. He was a Christian scholar, and he left the faith. He said, I don't believe it anymore because I think the Bible is corrupted. And if the Bible isn't preserved by God, then there must be no God. Therefore, there's no God. If you go online and find Muslim apologists who are trying to convert Christians, they will use his arguments almost word for word. The Bible is corrupted. The Bible is not preserved properly. The Bible, when it was originally written, didn't say Jesus is God. That nonsense came in later, which is what Bart Ehrman says, that Jesus and his followers didn't believe Jesus was God. That's what they did in the 4th century when the church was in control and they changed it. Now, history didn't go that way, and in my history of the Bible class, I demonstrate why that's a bunch of hogwash. But Muslims are like, yep, see, even your own scholars know that your Bible is corrupted. And so if you go to a Muslim and say, here, look, John 3:16, they're going to say, oh, that's not original, that was changed. So that's what we're dealing with. Questions? Whoa, my clock says 8 exactly. It's almost like I did that on purpose and I did not. It's mad skill. Questions about Islam that you have now before we wrap it up? All right. We will call it good and pick it up next week.